over to, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Howard and Jill. They have a presentation today that they'll do in 2 parts. So we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Howard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taylor. Good to be here, everyone. Good to see everyone who's been part of our Summer Academy. I've heard lots of phenomenal things about you all, that you've been engaging, grappling with some really powerful topics. So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you are doing. You're learning, you're growing, you're thinking. I want to say big shout out to Taylor Dudley, who I have the pleasure and honor to work with in the UCLA Pritzker Center. She is truly a force when it comes to the work around child welfare. She is someone who is intellectually gifted, connected, knowledgeable. So you all need to make sure you remain connected with her because she is phenomenal in this domain. I want to say thank you to Jill for working with my flexibility on this, because Jill and I had the good fortune of working together during the Pritzker Center speaker series. And in that regard, we kind of sort of went back and forth with each other. Today, I've got a little bit of a time constraint. So Jill was gracious enough to allow me to talk first. And so what I have is a bit of a presentation I want to give you that should take about 30 minutes or so. And then I want to open up for some Q&A because I love to get your feedback on it. I also see some of the folks who do phenomenal work with the UCLA Pritzker Center. I got to shout them out. Ruby Tucker, Ruby Tucker, Ruby Tucker. Can we get a wave, Ruby? Can we get a wave? There you go. Okay. She's a phenomenal part of our team. Brittany Hunt, can you? Okay. Teamwork makes the dream work, and we have a phenomenal team, and I'm glad to be a part of that. So let me just give a little bit of my background so it kind of sets the context for what I want to talk about. And as I'm doing this, if Ruby or Taylor or Brittany, whoever can give me the share screen option, it would be appreciated because I want to walk through some slides. So I've been on the faculty at UCLA for the past 20 years, and I come to this work as someone who is a former classroom teacher. And as a former classroom teacher, I've always been concerned about issues around educational access and opportunity. And as someone who is a product of Compton, California, I've been really concerned about issues where students of color, namely Black and Brown students, are afforded opportunities of access. And part of what my work has been around the last several decades has been looking at issues around racial inequality, racial disparities, and what schools and what other systems can do to begin to create better access. I've also had the good fortune of having a wife who was a social worker, and she worked for Los Angeles County for the Department of Family Services, Children and Family Services. And we would oftentimes compare notes between what I would see on the education side of the fence and what she would see on the child welfare side of the fence. And the more we would talk and the more we would exchange notes, it became clear that there was a lot of overlap between the two fields. Both serve children, both have tremendous responsibilities. Both jobs are incredibly difficult because you're dealing with children. And so part of what I want to talk about today is the manner upon which these two systems continue to inform one another, and how some of the challenges that we see on the education side are also prevalent on the social welfare side. And so what I want to start off with is explaining to you some of the real obstacles that we face in terms of racial disparity, racial inequity. And I understand you've talked about these issues. So I'm going to touch upon them real briefly on the education side of the fence, and then kind of walk you through where I think folks who are involved in the child welfare work can really be helpful. And Jill, I think, will be phenomenal in terms of, as she will serve as the main course. I am your appetizer, so I'll kind of warm you up, and then she'll kind of take you home in terms of what can be done from a legal standpoint on these issues. So with that being said, I will open up my screen and get us started. And like I said, this is really around intersections of education and child welfare, and I situate this work within the confines of why race and culture matter. And I raise issues of race and culture because oftentimes we want to think about the manner upon which we serve children really being about just serving children, and that their identities and that their backgrounds are not nearly as important in some people's eyes as they should be. And I would push back on those notions of people who say, well, we're just serving children, whether it be in education or social welfare, and let's look at the facts objectively, and let's make decisions about how we best serve them. And I would argue that we cannot do that without being really in tune with some of the important sort of variables that are entered into the equation when we think about how race and culture continue to be a big part of how we all live, how we all learn. And in many ways, I think race and culture are oftentimes front and center in how we decide to serve, excuse me, how we serve and who we serve when it comes to education and child welfare. And I think any real conversation, any real honest conversation that's devoid of issues of race and culture are not going to get to the full scope of the challenges that I think we have to understand about the children and families that we are working with and that we serve. So to that end, what I want to do is just kind of delve you into a couple of different points. And I always preface with this sort of important marker right here. Issues around race and culture are oftentimes very difficult for us to talk about in our society. I think race, by and large, has been a taboo topic. We're not sure what to say about it, how to talk about it. So in many instances, we avoid it, or we kind of sweep it under the rug, or we think, well, it's not important. And I think the more we tend to avoid issues of race and culture, the more we don't understand the very children and families that we are trying to be advocates for. So I maintain that we have to develop the courageous muscle to begin to talk about race, understand racial disparities, understand the ugly history of racism in our country, and the contemporary ways in which it manifests itself. But I do make this distinction between race and culture. And I'll get into some of these distinctions as I talk about this, because we tend to think that race and culture are the same, but they're very different in terms of culture being some of the norms and customs and values and traditions that we all have, and race being this phenotypically sort of ways in which we've been sort of socially constructed to fit in these categories based on physical characteristics and features. And I want to be clear as I talk about this, that we oftentimes view race and culture as synonymous, and it's important for us to remember that you can have individuals who are of the same racial background who can be very different culturally, okay? I'll say it again. People can be of the same racial background, but be very different culturally. And at the same time, you can have people who are very different racially, but can be very similar culturally, okay? I have to have you understand that, because culture is the stuff we do. Race matters, but I think if you really want to get to the core of who we are as people, I think it's the cultural orientations that shape us. Who we are, what we believe, how we communicate, the ways in which we live our lives, sort of what we value, our goals, aspirations, spiritual, religious convictions are all sort of guided in culture. Now, is there overlap between the two? Of course there is, but oftentimes we make this one-to-one correlation that if you're the same as someone racially, you must be the same culturally. So I raise that just as a point of departure. So let me move into one of the data points I frequently use to start this conversation about race and culture and what we tend to believe about race and culture. And one of the ways I frequently do that is by sharing data. So I'm going to share with you a couple of different points around data in schooling. And I would love to get your reactions in the chat just based on what I share with you here. So here's the first data point. What you're seeing here are high school graduation rates in our state of California from the 2018-2019 academic year. These data are broken down by race, ethnicity, and gender. So if you can, engage me for a moment. When you see these data, if you can go to the chat, just give me your initial reaction, just a couple words. What comes to mind? What jumps out at you? What surprises you? What grabs your attention? What gives you pause as you look at these data from the state of California when it comes to graduation rates? I'll give you a second to just sort of marinate on it and reflect on what you see there, and then kind of just respond off of your initial reactions. Thank you, Lauren. Lauren mentions the fact that we see that women are doing better across all ethnic and racial groups. Victoria points out that Latinx and Black students have the lowest graduation rates. I see Melanie talks about the fact that, again, what jumps out at you across all the different groups is the gender disparities. Thank you, Victoria. Victoria mentioned the fact that the gender binary is interesting. We've got to get to a point of how we collect data and think about data that doesn't sort of subscribe to that gender binary, but that's an important point. Rebecca mentions the fact that none are at 100%, and that should be our ultimate goal. APIs have some of the highest rates. Thank you for that point, Amy. And so what you see here is one of the important points that starts our conversation on disparities and racial disparities in a system, in this particular case around education. So now let me depart. So if I were to say you've seen these data, now if I were to ask you, give me one or two words in the chat about what explains why these gaps exist. So you all are some really intellectually gifted individuals. I see inequalities, history, good. What else explains these gaps? Bias, incarceration. DeMonte, good to see you out there. Taxation, access to resource and opportunities, funding, all of these different things, systemic racism. So this is important to talk about because part of what we have to understand as we address inequities that exist in any systems are root causes. Root causes really help to inform the ways in which we think about how we address these particular issues. And what is important, what I'm really pleased to see in your responses is that you're speaking to systemic issues that explain this, or historical issues. And that's encouraging because I've oftentimes shared these data points and you'd be amazed at how many classroom teachers, how many school leaders, and how many counselors have seen these same data and have said, well, this is a reflection of who values education more. This is a reflection of the families that they come from. This is a reflection of the motivation and who has more motivation than another group. This is a reflection of people who just don't have the discipline to do better in school. There's a lot of what I refer to as victim blaming here. And if there's a victim blaming approach in terms of how we see certain outcomes, it's only going to lead to more victim blaming types of responses and reactions. So the manner upon which we understand these issues is going to inform our action and our reaction to them. So it's important to understand the ways in which we have these racialized manners of how we see experiences in systems and how we begin to make sense out of them. And part of my ask of you is to think about this in ways that doesn't sort of just dump on people who have already been historically marginalized or to pathologize Black and brown individuals, but to begin to understand some of the complexities of the historical nature of race and racism, the historical nature of structural disadvantage, and the historical and contemporary ways in which they still play out today. So that's one data point I really appreciate your feedback on. So let me give you another data point, and this goes to something that's deeply disturbing when we think about how issues of disparity start early in our system and our structures. So now I'm going to talk to you briefly about discipline in schools. You all are familiar with discipline in schools. The primary means upon which we have data on discipline in schools are by way of suspensions and expulsions. And if you did not know, what I want to share with you is that now we've had, probably for the better part of the past decade and a half, we have data that shows we begin suspensions and expulsions in schools as early as preschool. And let me say that again, as early as preschool, we have data on suspensions of children in preschool. Now, you all know, how old are our children when they are in preschool? 3, 4, maybe 5 years old. And part of the concern here is that we have to ask, what is it that warrants or necessitates schools taking punitive actions to suspend and or expel children as early as preschool, when children are still engaged in the process of learning school, understanding school, understanding the social norms of how you participate in school. And there's a lot of social development that we're trying to help kids to understand. So I think one of the questions that comes up, what are some reasons to suspend a child in preschool? And that's a great question. I've asked lots of early childhood educators, what warrants a suspension in preschool? And I'm told typically 3 things explain why we suspend children in preschool. I'm told if you bite, if you fight, if you kick, those are some of the primary reasons why we suspend children. DeMonte says race, but hold on, DeMonte, you're one step ahead of me. Stay with me on the biting, fighting, and kicking. I'm with Caitlin. I don't think that there's anything that should warrant suspension in preschool, but what we know is, if we look at the data, that suspension rates are uneven across the board. And when we take a closer look at this, what we see is the following. We see that Black and Latinx children make up about 35% of all children who are enrolled in preschools across the United States, but they make up 72% of students who are suspended once and 78% of students who are expelled from school. So I need you to lock in on these numbers again. 35% of the population, 72% of students who are suspended, 78% of students who are expelled from preschool. So again, I need to hear from you. Engage me for a second in the chat. What explains such significant disparity in terms of why we see Black and brown children suspended and expelled at the rates that they are in our country? Give me some reactions. Victoria just says, ugh. She keeps saying, ugh. I agree with you. Jessica says we got implicit bias, unconscious bias. I go back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of why we see children in preschool being suspended. And what I'm oftentimes told anecdotally is that issues of kicking, hitting, biting being the primary culprits. The last time I checked, there are lots of 3 and 4-year-old children who bite, fight, and kick. I believe personally that white children who are 3 and 4 years old bite and fight and kick. I believe that white children who are 3 and 4 years old bite, fight, and kick. And I believe that black and brown children who are 3 and 4 years old bite, fight, and kick. So I think Grace's point is important here. When we talk about a lack of understanding from teachers, I think in many ways you have the same behavior that's occurring across the ethnic and racial spectrum. However, some children are punished at a far greater level than others are. So this is something I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this within the education context, because then we'll move into the child welfare context. Again, same behaviors, but oftentimes seen in very different ways and oftentimes responded to in very different ways based on racial classifications. So it's important to keep in mind here that when we start young to begin to put labels on children, rarely are those labels removed. When we start young and we label children as being problematic, those labels typically are not removed. And I should also note that when you look at the data on high school graduation and suspension, there's a correlation that for any student who's been suspended one time, the likelihood that that student graduates from high school decreases by about 20%. So I need you to understand the last slide I showed you, where you saw the groups who had the lowest graduation rates, namely Black and brown children, and connect that data to what you're seeing here with suspensions of Black and brown children as early as 3 and 4 years old. The labels are applied, the labels are stuck, and rarely do they come off. So we need to begin to understand the policing, the surveillance, the monitoring of young Black and brown bodies at an early age. So let's go one step further on this now, because I want to try to make the connection here, and I'd love to get your feedback on where this all sort of fits. So several of you have mentioned the fact that implicit bias explains much of this, and I would agree with you. I think much of what we see around suspensions of children in early childhood is tied to implicit bias. I would strongly encourage you to look at the work by Walter Gilliam, who looks at implicit biases regarding sex and race related to children in preschools. And what he found, him and his team found, that basically that preschool teachers were more inclined to lock in and focus in on the behaviors of Black and brown children. They scrutinized their behaviors in ways that they did not scrutinize the behaviors of Asian and white children. They were more likely to suggest or recommend punitive consequences for Black and brown children in ways that they didn't for other children. So these biases are part of the ways in which the larger society, in many ways, really socializes all of us in terms of how we begin to see certain populations. So implicit biases regarding race and criminal delinquent behavior are real. Teachers are less likely to respond to empathy when a child of a race is different to his, her, or their own, are exhibiting challenging behaviors. And what we want to remember is that this is oftentimes a vicious cycle that only exacerbates inequalities, okay? Now, again, I want to stay clear on the fact that these labels, these biases that oftentimes are a byproduct of the larger society that shapes the way that we see certain people. Now, if I go one step further, I want to share with you 2018, 2019 data on the top reasons for school suspensions in the state of California. And I really want to get your feedback here on the chat. Here you see to your left are the top reasons for suspensions in our state. And really what I want you to help me to understand, because it's like a head scratcher for me, the top reasons that we suspend children, are they subjective or objective? So let me just get reactions from you briefly in the chat. Let's take the top two. Defiance, disrespect, are those objective or subjective types of behaviors? Defiance, I'm getting lots of subjective, 100% subjective, 100% subjective. So what defiance is in the eyes of one person, it's going to look fundamentally different from what defiance looks like in another person's eye. I'll go one step further. I would ask you, can you give me any of the behaviors on that list, on this list, that you think are objective? Let's see where you are. Are any of these items on this list objective? Weapons, Victoria says. Anybody else? Anything here that's objective? Drug possession, objective. Okay, Mary says that. Anything else? Okay, I'm getting chronic absenteeism, objective. Okay, thank you, Maya. Weapons, fighting, objective. Okay, let me push back a little bit, because I would make the argument, and I love to have you all continue to just push back on me. I would make the argument that all of these are subjective, each and every one of them. Let me explain to you why I think drug possession is even subjective. I think also all of them are objective. I meant to say all of them are subjective. I think all of them are subjective. I think drug possession is subjective because we think of drug possession. If I bring aspirin to school, is that drug possession? If I have a Midol, or if I have Excedrin, is that a drug? Would that result in some form of suspension? So again, the manner upon which we see some drugs compared to others might be highly subjective. Even weapons. Okay, so the question is, what is a weapon? Is a pencil a weapon? We tend to think of weapons as only being things that are violent, but we have weapons that can be, are my hands weapons? I think weapons in the eyes of many people can be looked at through a very subjective kind of a interpretation. Even fighting, I think, could be considered subjective because there are ways in which, again, certain people may engage in a verbal back and forth that may not be fighting in the eyes of some, but could be seen as fighting in the eyes of others. I think that the ways in which we engage in heated discussions are not fights. I believe that when we're very animated, they're not fights, but that's my personal interpretation in terms of how I see those interactions. The one I can't understand is chronic absenteeism. So in certain districts across the state of California, if you are absent in more than 10 days, we suspend you for 3 days. Let me get you to understand that again. Okay, if you are absent for more than 10 days, you are suspended for 3 days. So now, why would we have a policy that says if you miss a certain number of days, our response to that is to have you miss additional days? So I would argue that the ways in which we are responding to students on issues of discipline raise lots of questions around the manner upon which we leave it up to subjective interpretation, right? And I want you to then couple this subjective interpretation with the implicit bias. So if we know that there's implicit bias, if we know that there are ways in which, say, brown people, black people, brown children, children, poor children are seen, when we apply this interpretive lens, it tends to have a much more damaging impact on certain populations compared to others. That making sense to everybody? Okay. And to the point that Lucy raises, the last time I checked, I don't know any student who comes back to school after being suspended and says, I'm a better student now because I was suspended. I'm going to be better because I was suspended. I'm going to be more attentive because I was suspended. Typically, suspension is traumatic for students because it ostracizes them, removes them from a learning process, and causes additional types of challenges. So I digress. So let me move on. So part of what I want us to understand is that there are oftentimes these normative understandings of how we view learners. And culture shapes the way we communicate, culture shapes our behavior, and culture shapes the ways that we process and understand information. However, if we have teachers who engage in this process, who bring their own interpretive lens, have their own normative sort of biases, that they see communication happening in certain ways, behavior has to happen in certain ways, and you must process, think, and understand in certain ways, here's where we have some challenges. Because in many instances, you may have educators who believe that if you're not communicating, speaking, and expressing yourself in the way that I deem appropriate, then that is seen as a problem. The same thing with behavior. If you're not acting in ways that I think is normative behavior, then that's a problem. Same thing with learning. If you don't process and understand and participate in the learning process in ways that I think is normative, then that's a problem. So the question here is, when we think about communication, when we think about behavior and process and understanding, that these are very culturally specific, okay? Now, let's start with communication just as a case in point. I think communication is highly, highly sort of culturally mediated. Many of us come from households where if we have big families, you're communicating and one person's talking and another person just starts talking over that person, and then the other person cuts in, and the next person cuts in, and it's all very part of how the communication norms happen. And we talk over each other, we talk right through each other, we don't let someone finish their sentence. So culture shapes communication. But then some students come to school and we are told that if you want to communicate in school, you must do what? You must raise your hand. And for some kids, culturally speaking, that is very foreign. I mean, I don't raise my hand at home. I can speak because I'm moved, because spontaneity shows that you're interested, that you have a certain level of impulsivity to really be engaged in something. So then part of what we have to recognize is that some of these norms that schools suggest are quite normative are very different from the kind of cultural norms that students bring from home. And I think it affects children of color more so than white children. It affects poor children more so than middle-class children. And that's just with communication. There are lots of other examples I can give. Behavior, same thing. Process and understanding is the same thing as well. So stay with me as we kind of go through this. So then if there are normative understanding of how we learn, my question for everyone is, are there then normative ways of what good parenting looks like? What would you say? Are there normative ways of how we in our society have defined good parenting? And I put good parenting in quotations because now I'm making the transition to child welfare. I think much in the way that we have normative sort of understandings of what good learning or good students or good behavior, good communication is like, the same thing happens with good parenting. And I see what Taylor says here. Yes, that the standard is oftentimes white parenting, but I'll go one step further, Taylor. I will say it's not just white parenting, it's white middle-class parenting, right? So part of what I think we have to be mindful of is that much in the way that we have these norms of behavior and education, we also have them when we come to define what good parenting looks like. Now, you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. Why does this matter when it comes to how we think about good parenting? Because this has major, major ramifications for child welfare. Because much in the way that I think that we have teachers who might be well-intentioned, but let's be clear, not all good intentions have good outcomes. There are teachers who look at certain behaviors, and if it doesn't fit their norm of what good student means, there are consequences. The same thing if you think about this on the child welfare side. There are social workers who engage in this work who have notions of what they believe good parenting is. If that good parenting does not fit within the confines of how they define good parenting, then certain families and certain children and certain parents are going to be seen as problematic. And I raise that because we have to ask the question here about, does bias exist in the child welfare system? We've talked about this on the education side. Caitlin says yes, 100%. Daisy says 100%. I see a lot of yeses. So here's the hard question that we have to start asking about child welfare, is that there are those folks who are out there who think that no, bias does not exist in child welfare. We deal with issues around poverty. We deal with issues around neglect. We deal with issues around abuse in a very objective manner. And it's very clear that there are some objective criteria that we use. And I would push back on that. I would argue that there are lots of biases in the child welfare system. And as Victoria says, logically, it's impossible to not be biased. We are all biased in some way, shape, or form, because why? We are human beings, and we are socialized from the time we take our first breaths about what is good, what is not good, what is normal, what is abnormal, what is typical, what is atypical. So therefore, I think we have to start asking some hard questions about racial bias in the child welfare system. So let's go a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the fact that LA County has an issue when it comes to racial disproportionality with children who end up in foster care. And without going into a lot of the details on data, because you all probably have talked about this and discussed this, in LA County, you see these data here. Black children make up about 6%, 7% of the children in all of Los Angeles County, but make up about 30% of the children who are in foster care. Black children are the only group who are that significantly overrepresented in child welfare. Most of the other groups that we see in the county are relatively close to their overall makeup of the population. Most of them, white children and Asian children, are underrepresented when it comes to their makeup in the child welfare system. And Latinx children, last time I checked, are relatively close to their overall numbers. So the question becomes, why are Black children so woefully overrepresented in the child welfare system? I want to hear you respond. Again, 6% of the population, 30% of the children who are in foster care. How do you make up 6%, 7% of the population of a county, but you're almost a third of all the children who are in foster care? Give me some thoughts in the chat about what do you think explains that. Majority of teachers who are mandated reporters are white. Caitlin says, good point about cultural misunderstanding, bias. Megan makes a good point about poverty being punished. school resource officers. You all are, man, you all are on it. I need you all to come help teach these classes with me across the campus. More single parents in these households. Grant makes an important point because oftentimes we see single parent household through a deficit lens in ways that we don't see two-parent household. That's an important point. Ideas that Black families are violent. You know, we tend to have these biases much in the way that we see with preschool behavior. The same thing I mentioned with regard to what are good families. Culture of surveillance, systemic racism. So the bottom line is if you're going to pursue child welfare work in the city of Los Angeles, I would say in the county of Los Angeles, I think we have to ask these questions around why there is racial bias, why racial disproportionality exists. Understand that raising these questions, oftentimes you're going to be resisted with lots of pushback. People don't want to engage in this conversation. People don't really want to have a honest, really poignant discussion around why these issues are real. Look, Taylor knows. Taylor and I have been down at DCFS having these conversations, trying to get folks in positions of power to take this issue more seriously. In my humble opinion, I don't think folks want to touch this because it gets to the heart of racism and systemic racism. So I think we have to understand that Black children have been disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system for decades. And if you look at the data, here's what we know. I just showed you that here, not only in Los Angeles County, but nationwide, Black children are overrepresented in every aspect of child welfare. Not only that, but we know that Black children are more likely to be removed from their homes after a child abuse referral has been received, more so than any other student group. We also know that Black children, once removed from their homes, are less likely to be reunified with their birth family after removal from homes, as I mentioned. And Black children are most likely to have longer stays in the foster care in comparison to children of other races. So this is oftentimes, I would argue, baked in the system, this sort of this structural disadvantage, historical racism, where children of color, and in this case, we're talking Black children, are oftentimes facing higher obstacles, Black families facing higher obstacles compared to other children in the system. If we're not asking questions about this, I don't think we're truly committed to social justice, racial justice in these systems that are supposedly serving our children. So I'll go one step further. So child welfare is not exempt from structural racism and implicit bias. We've established that, and this is the question we must continue to come back from. Please make note of the name Jessica Price, because I'm going to talk about her in one moment. But I need you to understand that the pervasiveness of racism is real. There's not just there are multiple levels of this that I think we should be engaged in on a regular basis. There's internalized racism, where people begin to sort of have these really destructive and deficit notions of people who are of particular races, sometimes members of their own race. There's interpersonal racism, where you got racial slurs and bigotry, hate crimes, and racial violence that can occur. Then there's institutional racism, where you can have notions of racism are tied to the way I think about it in terms of power, systems of power. And I think about child welfare, I think about education as being systems of power that oftentimes have policies and procedures that are baked in racial discrimination that only perpetuate that. And then there's structural racism. This is the history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies and procedures that provide certain privileges to white people that are not provided to people of color. So to understand these different levels of racism and how we have to be advocates to chip away at these different systems of racism, when and where and how we see them existing, okay? So I mentioned Jessica Price. I think Jessica Price is doing some important work with child welfare because she has been engaged in this process called blind review. And I would strongly encourage all of you to take a look at Jessica Price's work, because I think it could be something that helps us to begin to unpack the ways in which racial discrimination in the child welfare system is impacting Black children. So what is blind review process, you might ask? So what Jessica Price and her team did was they put together committees of child welfare professionals who come together to determine if a child or children should be removed from their home. So you bring together a group of social workers, and what they do is say, should these children be removed from the home? Now, what makes this process a blind removal is that the caseworker who has already seen the family and conducted an initial assessment of risk will present the facts to the case, but never mention anything about demographics or neighborhood. So all is reported are the facts, okay? One step further, all identifiable information on the case is removed, and the discussion focuses on what has occurred, relevant history, family capacity, and strengths and assets of that family. That's important to notice, because in this process, if we're not talking about strengths and assets of family, that's a big, big omission. And after the presentation of the case, the committee makes a recommendation regarding whether the children should be removed from the family. Now, it's a process that many social workers go through, but the key here, according to Dr. Price and her team, is that if you remove identifying factors such as what? Race, ethnicity, zip code, things that we typically will use to determine where a family or a child or a parent group sits in terms of their racial identification, socioeconomic status, just to look at the information on the family to see if it warrants removal from the household. And what Jessica Price and her team have found is that tracking the process over 5 years, so they've got a pretty huge data set here, has rendered some pretty staggering results. The rate started at about 55% of Black children being removed from their homes. Through the blind removal process, they have seen the number of children being removed for Black down to 29%. That's a 30%, I'm sorry, about a 25% reduction. And so what they are basically saying is that what we are learning is that when it comes to how workers see families and children, that yes, race matters. And so what Jessica Price and her team are suggesting is that do we engage in more blind removal process across other child welfare systems across our country? Because when people don't know the race, when they don't know the ethnicity, when they don't know the socioeconomic status, they tend to make more, shall we say, reasonable kinds of responses. I think this is staggering. I think this is eye-opening. I think this is really, really important. And so what basically Dr. Price has said is that when you use a colorblind approach to assessing the cases in child welfare, the results for children of color may be actually better, which is an eye-opener for me because I'm someone who's on the education side who has oftentimes said that colorblindness is harmful for children of color because we act as if their race and ethnicity doesn't matter. But Jessica Price's work is telling us that when it comes to looking at whether or not children should be removed from families, that perhaps we should remove race from that criteria because that way people's racial biases do not necessarily come into play. Now, some folks are pushing back on Dr. Price's work and asking, do we still perpetuate colorblind ideology? And Taylor and I have been fortunate enough to engage her in these processes, and she says she understands that critique, but we need to continue to look at the data of what it says and how do we find ways to remove people's biases from these decision-making processes. I am pleased to say that we are talking to Dr. Price now about how she can come here to Los Angeles and work with us in the Pritzker Center to see how we might begin to share her work, learn more about her work, and understand how we might take some steps to begin to enlighten folks who are involved in this process. So I think there's some promise here. I think it's important. Kudos to Taylor for reaching out and having a number of conversations with Dr. Price because we think that there's something here that we can learn from her work. So let me go a few more slides and then I want to stop and see if we've got some question and answer because bottom line here, what I want to try to convey, and I hope I've done it in some kind of coherent way. I know I might sound like I'm all over the place here, but what we know is that child welfare and education system targets the intersection of race and poverty. Now I'd also add gender in that because when you see poor Black and brown women, we know that the kinds of systems of disadvantage have an impact on them in ways that other women and other groups are not impacted. And when you look at the child welfare system, we see that there are lots of women who fit that criteria. Single mothers who are poor and who are Black and brown. But when the focus is on child removals rather than social services and support, that might help to alleviate the impacts of poverty, and it uproots Black and brown children from their homes on the basis of little to no evidence of abuse, and in some cases, little to no evidence of neglect, but summarily places them into middle to upper class, and oftentimes, more than not, white homes. We have to raise some hard questions. And these are questions that many of us don't like to engage in terms of, how and why we engage in the traumatic process of removing children from their households, a traumatic experience for children socially, emotionally, academically, and the list goes on. So to that end, I would say there's some work that you all should begin to familiarize yourself with. Dorothy Roberts' book is considered a must-read for anyone in child welfare around Shattered Bonds, where she unpacks just the long, sordid, ugly history of the manner upon which child welfare has been really detrimental to many families of color. I would strongly encourage you to read that. Andrew Billingsley and Jean Giovanni have done work that was even prior to Dorothy Roberts that discuss Children of the Storm, again, the impact of Black families with child welfare. And I would also recommend that you take a look at some of Emma Ketteringham's work, where she talks really about sort of the manner upon which, if you are poor, the increased likelihood that you are to find yourself in the child welfare system for some of the same behaviors that may take place in more middle class and affluent households, but poor parents are scrutinized, poor parents are surveilled, poor parents are sort of pathologized more for their parenting than their more affluent counterparts would be. So to that end, I would say that we all collectively need to be engaged in this work around how we can dismantle acts and institutional policies that are not only around anti-Black racism, because it doesn't stop there. It also has to begin to disrupt xenophobia. It must also disrupt transphobia and homophobia. I think we have to push back hard on policies that are oftentimes homophobic in terms of their impact, that sanction gendered violence, that put poor folks at a disadvantage, that are tied to stereotyping and prejudice, and any other form of racial exclusion. And I think all these are acts of violence. They're acts of violence against poor people, Black people, brown people, in ways that systems that are designed supposedly to support and serve these families and children oftentimes have the exact opposite effect in ways that need to be called on the carpet. And we must ask hard questions, remain steadfast, collect data, and begin to find our ways to more viable, affirming, race-conscious, gender-conscious solutions. So let me stop right there and see if we can open up for some questions, answers, critiques, disagreements, and the like. We've covered a lot of territory in a short period of time here.
I have a question.
Yes.
I come from a special education background, and in my dissertation work, I'm looking at the inequity across educational placements. So where students with disabilities are placed. So are they in more segregated or inclusive educational placements? And what I'm finding is, of course, there is a huge race difference. And so oftentimes I think about this like kind of blind determination component that might actually be really helpful for placement determination, and would just like your thoughts on that too, and any thoughts you have about yeah, I guess how you see that being used in the school system, the blind determination kind of theoretical framework.
Yeah, so I'm grappling with this one. I think your question, Caitlin, is really a good one. And this is the same question I asked to Dr. Price, because for so long, my work had been centered on disrupting colorblind ideology because of the manner upon which I think it reinforced current racial hierarchies. But what Dr. Price's work is suggesting is that when it comes to making really pivotal decisions about placements, about removal, about special education designation, people's racial biases play out more so than we want to acknowledge. And if we know that and we're aware of that, then the question becomes, what can we do to mitigate or reduce or eliminate those racial biases? Now, there's a lot of research that looks at the effects of implicit bias, and there's an argument that you can make that we must engage in more racial bias, more implicit bias training, and that's fine, and I would be all in favor of that, but these are decisions that are having to be made in the here and now. And when it comes to the fact that if we looked at similar kinds of studies in education, I think it might yield some important insights. If we looked at children across the board and we took away identifying information and just looked at the behaviors, or look at the learning outcomes, or look at the learning experience devoid of children's race or ethnicity, does that change the manner upon which children are placed in with the special education designation? Special education, as you well know, is rife with racial disparity, right? And what we see is that Black and brown and poor children are more likely to be overrepresented in special education, and their classifications are not in areas that are quote unquote somewhat objective, such as say visual impairment, hearing impairment, if they're on the autism spectrum. Where we see Black and brown and poor children overrepresented are in areas such as behaviorally challenging, mentally, what they used to call mentally, educationally disrupted. So these subjective behaviors, subjective categories, I say, around behavior is where we see there's oftentimes a lot more disparity. So I think it's important to at least engage in the conversation and be willing to think twice about if some of these ways in which we sort of diagnose, place, remove children, be it in the education world or the social welfare world, if the racial identifiers hurt children of color more than we may even realize.
Thank you.
I want to hop in. It's Victoria. Hi, Dr. Howard.
Hey, Victoria. How are you? Long time no see.
I'm good. I'm good. I don't know. I really grapple with this. I've talked to Dr. Price about this too, but I am a little bit more like radical leaning, I think, than a lot of people on here. But I just really grapple with this like notion of blind removal. I do appreciate it for what it is, but I think it's such a Band-Aid cover up for so many of the issues. We have like a huge issue we have is reporting. The tools we use, like we still have the, regardless if like we're blind to some of these really important factors, there's still these SDM that we use. There are these histories, like our families have been surveilled through years and years and years. So you have all of this historical data on all of these families that compound into this really big decision to remove. And then even before then, like I'm saying, like the mandatory reporting and that kind of process. And I am really leaning towards the movement to really reimagine this entire system, whether that means abolishing it and making it new. I know there's a movement, like the up-in movement is gaining a lot of traction right now. And so I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts of that? Because I think like we can reform the system all we want, but like the ideology of the system in itself is punitive. It always has been.
So V, I love your spirit of wanting to rethink and reimagine and reconstruct an entirely different system. I think that's where we have to be in terms of what would it look like if we didn't have the existing system, much in the way that we've started this conversation around police and policing and the need for policing. I think a similar conversation is warranted with regard to child welfare, because to a large degree, many of these systems have not served certain families and certain communities well. And so I think we have to sort of do two things at the same time. And I think on the one hand, we have to put efforts and energy and time and commitment and resources in to begin to imagine what a different system and structure looks like. Or we have to ask ourselves the question, do we need a child welfare system at all? And what would something that's alternative to that look like? But in the interim, I think the challenge before us is that we still have children who are in this current system. And we have to kind of act in the moment, because there are children who are separated from families. There are children whose cases are tied up in the courts. And so as we're sort of thinking global, we still have to act local. So I think Dr. Price's work, which I'm glad you're grappling with, that's what we're supposed to do as thinkers. We're supposed to sort of push back and challenge and ask hard questions. I think what Dr. Price is doing, she's saying, I'm taking a small slice of this to say, what does it mean to think about decisions that caseworkers use to decide to remove children from families. But there's so many other factors. Part of what we know, and Taylor and I and a team of our folks went down to DCFS several months back before the close before closing of schools. And what we learned is that 65% of all referrals come from classroom teachers. So there's another part of this work that needs to be placed on teacher education programs that says, what is it that teachers are doing that explains why teachers are more likely to refer some kids to be looked at compared to others. So there's a lot of different ways. I think the policing aspect of this is tied to this. So to me, we have to look at the sort of the intersecting systems, social work, social welfare, education, mental health, the legal aspect of this. All these systems come together in ways that do serious, serious harm to Black, brown, and poor children. So I appreciate the questions that you're asking. And that's why I'm waiting for you to finish up that doctorate, because with that doctorate, you're going to help us to reimagine what these systems look like. So part of what we'll be talking about is not only Dr. Price's work, but the future Dr. Copeland, her work will be telling us something else as well. I'm just putting that out there for the universe to marinate on. So thank you, V, for that question. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, disagreements? Please push back. I'm trying to figure this stuff out myself. I don't know it all. I'm trying to understand it better, and smart minds like yours will help me to think about it. I'm a former classroom teacher. I believe in wait time.
I have a question.
Yes.
So my background in my field is developmental psychology. I'm about to start a developmental psychology PhD at UCLA. And I definitely, thanks. I definitely see a lot of these that you've mentioned reflected in the field of developmental psychology, like the ideology of like what good parenting is and things like that. And there, I think there's like historically, I mean, I know that historically that has caused a lot of harm. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for someone who's starting to go into that field on how to like push back in the field in like a more research oriented context. Like, I think, I mean, obviously that part of that is like doing that work in my own head and like in my own thinking, and also in terms of critiquing what has been done and like moving the field as a whole toward a better place.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. And first of all, again, congratulations, Fran, on your admittance to the program. But what you need to be prepared for as you embark upon this work is remember why you started this process in the first place. If you are pushing back against systems of oppression, be they gendered systems of oppression or racialized systems of oppression, stay true to that. There are going to be people who try to critique you excessively. There will be people who tell you that, why do you always have to focus on that population or that topic? But that's how paradigms change. One of my favorite pieces of work is Thomas Kuhn's work around sort of paradigm shifts. And what Kuhn's work says is that when existing paradigms fall short, it's imperative and it's important for folks like yourselves here to begin to help us establish new paradigms. That means we ask hard questions. That means we use new frameworks. That means we are willing to sort of disrupt the traditional canons that have not served women and poor people and folks of color well. And I think you just have to have a thick skin as you do this work, because people are going to come after you because they don't want these systems to be critiqued. They don't want them to be attacked. So to that end, I would also argue, and I would also recommend that you've got to be well-read across the board. You've got to understand what the limitations are of existing bodies of research. You have to be willing to talk about current forms of research that are beginning to elevate these questions in a much more affirming and enlightening manner. And you have to understand that this is a marathon. And not a sprint. And so you have to see the big picture, but surround yourself with the folks who are part of this summer academy. Surround yourself with like-minded folks, because you will need a squad, because there are days where you will think, maybe I'm crazy, maybe something's wrong with me. And I would say you are not crazy. It's the system and structure that's crazy, but you need these folks here to fortify you, to lift you up, to tell you, no, you're not crazy. You're fighting the right fight. You're fighting the just fight. That sometimes you get folks who will try to somehow get you to think twice about why you're doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's very helpful and inspirational.
Good. Thank you so much. I got about 2 minutes, then I got to jump on another call, folks. So speak now, forever hold your peace.
Hi, Professor Howard. I have a question. My name is Melanie. I took your Education 130 class last quarter.
Best class at UCLA.
Yes, definitely. So I'm kind of with Victoria, where I do agree, where I feel like the entire system needs to be reformed. However, I also agree with your statement saying, like, how do we focus on the now? So I kind of suggested more socio-cultural competence, like training for educators and social workers. So how do you believe that we should go about like ensuring that that's actually pushed for the social welfare foster system? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Great question. So this may sound like a simplistic answer, but I think we need more people in the training of social workers and the training of teachers who have a certain kind of critical consciousness around these issues that we're talking about. Because we focus on the behaviors of the people in the field, but we don't critique the folks who trained them. And sometimes the people who are doing the training are worse than the people who are doing the work, because they're the ones who are basically reinforcing these practices and ideologies. So that's why I need everybody who's on this, who's part of our academy, to do all that you were doing to get the proper credentialing, degrees, certifications. We need an army of critically conscious thinkers who can be involved in the training of the next generation of child welfare providers. And it's not just, let me be clear, it's not just education and social welfare. The same thing exists in medicine. The same thing exists in mental health. The same thing exists across these different fields, that people have these really deficit notions of certain populations. And I think that we have to recognize that these practices and processes were decades and decades in the making, and we want to see them gone like yesterday. And I just have to be a bearer of bad news. It's not going to happen that way. We have to sort of build, think, plan, and proactively respond in ways that allows us to change these systems of disadvantage. And I think I'm inspired when I hear and interact with young folks such as yourself, because it lets me know that there's an army of up and coming thinkers who are way smarter than I am, who are way more determined than I am. And that gives me hope, and that gives me satisfaction. So for that, I say, let's get the work done.
Thank you, Professor. It's people like you that inspire the rest of us to want to reform and make a change.
Thank you all. Now you've had the appetizer. My dear colleague, Jill Rowland, will be the main entree. So I'm going to sign off and say thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you do.
Man, how do I follow that? Dang.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, Jill. Welcome. So this is our
Tough to follow, but I will do my best.
Well, we're so glad you're here. And for those of you who might have missed the first few seconds of the call or the meeting, I mentioned that Jill is a formidable attorney for children in the foster care system, a longstanding advocate, particularly in the education space, and really does her part to address those disparities that Dr. Howard outlined through a legal framework within the special education realm, as well as within school districts, statewide, nationally. She's really changed not only individual children's lives with respect to their education, but also how the system itself works at large. So we're really excited to have her. She's been such a loyal and generous friend to the center, and is also a UCLA law grad. So we're going to have a Bruin with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Jill, to share your brilliance with us, and we want to share our gratitude with you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. So man, Dr. Howard gets me every time. He gets me so excited and revved up, and now I gotta try to live up to that standard. I'm not sure if I'll be as exciting, but I'm gonna do my best. The first topic I am going to cover today is a little bit about trauma. So while I do kind of a general introduction of myself and my organization, I would love it if you guys would throw into the chat box just kind of your general understanding. I know you had some introduction and training around trauma. So how would you define trauma, and how would you define resilience? Because we know it's really important to talk about both of those things together. So my name is Jill Rowland. I'm the director of the education program at the Alliance for Children's Rights. The Alliance is a nonprofit legal services organization providing direct services to children in Los Angeles County, specifically in the Los Angeles County dependency system, as well as doing advocacy at both the state and sometimes even at the federal level. The Alliance was basically created to fill in all the gaps in the system. So we finalize about 1/3 of the adoptions coming out of LA County foster care. Were created more than 25 years ago because there were 10,000 kids ready to be adopted, but there were no attorneys to do the paperwork to get that done. That's why my agency was originally created. So we do a ton of adoption work, and then we do a whole lot of work around making sure kids have access to services. I run our education program. We do a lot of education work, but we also do healthcare advocacy, financial benefits advocacy, mental health advocacy. We're working with youth who are transitioning out of the system, helping them with housing and college and mental health, and if they're pregnant and parenting, and getting them those services. We, in the education program, work around early intervention, so helping kids access early intervention services from birth to age 3 through regional centers under the Early Start Act. At age 3, when kids transition over into the school district, and all through from 3 to high school graduation, we do special education advocacy. So that means advocating to help kids get their IEPs, and I'll touch a little bit about over and under representation that Dr. Howard mentioned earlier. And then we also do what I call the general education rights of youth in foster care, as well as youth in the juvenile justice system. And we're going to talk a little bit about those rights as well. So do I have any takers in the chat? Thoughts on how you would define trauma, how you would define resilience? I am going to give you a quick little definition, but I'd love to see what you guys have to think. So thank you for Caitlin. Trauma is an experience or repeated experiences that create harmful and prolonged stress responses. That's a great definition, Caitlin. Anybody else want to take a stab? How about resilience? What does resilience mean to you? All right, well, I know, as I said, Dr. Howard was amazing. Oh, let's see, we got some more stuff coming in. Resilience is, just trying to scroll through the chat box here. Of course, it's not going to cooperate with me. Moving forward despite barriers, adversity, and challenges, mental and emotional process of dealing or coming to terms with the events or circumstances a person faces. Really important to have resilience related to child development, the ability to bend but not break. I love that. The ability to bounce back from adversity or challenges. So many great definitions. And there are pretty much a million different amazing great definitions of resilience and trauma. You can see where I got this one from. The reason why I like this definition is it both talks about individual trauma as well as community trauma. Some examples of community trauma, you can think about being in the concentration camps in World War II. You can think about 9/11 as a community trauma. Certainly the fires that we have been having in California over the years, those are definitely community traumas. And I would actually put COVID in kind of a world community trauma. So those are different ways that I like to kind of expand that scope a little bit. Of course, this is not going to let me scroll. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. So I'm not going to actually show the video removed. Hopefully some of you have heard about it or seen it. If you're looking for something to do kind of after the session today, this is a great thing to do. So removed is a video that spends a little bit of time following the life of Zoe. It is a dramatization. It is not a real story, but I do think it has a lot of the themes that we see in child welfare. A lot of my clients, I hear them talk about being the trash bag kid, and there's a really kind of poignant visual in this video when she's starting to throw her things into a trash bag to move from home to home. And we see a lot of other themes related to, you know, the police coming in and taking her away from her family and what that does, you know, in terms of the social contract you might have, depending on your situational experiences with the police as someone to keep you safe, which I know is not the experience that a lot of people have. There is this idea of moving home to home to home and not ever finding that place, the idea of being separated from your siblings. So it just gives a really good idea of what that might feel like or might be experienced. The things that I don't like about removed is it is a beautiful little white girl. So that's not helpful because I don't think it is representative of our child welfare system. And there is a positive outcome at the end, which I don't necessarily think is representative of our child welfare system. There is actually also a follow-up removed 2. So if you're in, it's about 20-25 minutes. So if you're really interested, you can continue to follow Zoe's story. So if you've had any experience with trauma, you've probably heard of the ACEs study. And ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. The things that I think are something that's not always talked about when people talk about ACEs are the fact that this was a study that was started at Kaiser in San Diego, and it was actually a study based on health outcomes. So Kaiser was saying, you know, a bunch of people come in their 50s and 60s, and they have these like really bad health outcomes, heart disease, cancers, different things like that. And the doctors were like, what's causing all this? Like, let's do a longitudinal study. Let's go back and ask all of these patients, you know, a million different things about their life. And let's see if we can figure out like why some people have these really bad health outcomes and why they don't. And the response was adverse childhood experiences. And this was, they were not looking for this. They did not expect this. And the really interesting thing is adverse childhood experiences do lead to these health outcomes, these negative health outcomes, regardless of where you do the study. Across the United States over time, they have these same crazy outcomes. And so, you know, you think that if you're exposed to trauma when you're a kid, you're going to have mental health issues, but you're actually going to have all of these other health issues as well. And here's just some examples. So right now, out of 100 given American adults, about a third of us have no ACEs, no adverse childhood experiences. And then 51% of us have about 1 to 3, and 16% have 4 to 8 ACEs. And you can see really significantly how the health outcomes kind of jump so significantly when we have the ACEs go up: suicide, smoking, alcoholics, IV drug use, heart disease, etc. So, you know, it's one of those things that it's not what I might have expected before, you know, I kind of entered into this field. And if, you know, you talk to a layperson on the street, maybe a relative, they may not expect that, but it's a really significant outcome. When kids go through trauma, there are actual changes in their brain. These are 2 scale comparisons of a 3-year-old child normal brain and a neglect brain, the brain of a child who's been neglected. And you can see the size is different. The amount of, you know, darkness versus light is different. So there's actual like chemical and structural differences in the brain for kids. And this isn't even abuse, this is just neglect. So that's really significant. So just to talk a little bit more about the brain, and I'll give a full disclaimer here. I am a lawyer. I am not a scientist. Probably many of you are studying in the science field, but I'm going to totally cheat and use my notes because I always have to on this slide. So when we talk about how trauma impacts the brain, we're going to talk about a couple of different components or sections of the brain. And so when kids are experiencing trauma, the emotional part of the brain, or the part of the brain that covers emotions, the amygdala, becomes overactive. And so what happens is, in a normal response, fear response, something scary happens. Let's say you almost get in a car accident. Your fight, flight, or freeze is going to be triggered. That's your natural survival response. So if you're in the woods being chased by a bear, your flight response, you're going to get extra adrenaline pumping and strength in your body and be able to run really fast to get away from that bear. That is triggered by your amygdala, and it's a really healthy, good response that you definitely need and can help you in those dangerous situations, can help you to survive. But if you go through trauma, that amygdala becomes bigger and stronger because it is constantly being activated over and over and over again. And because it's constantly being advocated, because you're being traumatized over and over again, becomes really, really sensitive. So at even like the slightest hint that there might be a threatening situation, it's gonna, you know, the alarms are gonna be going off. Think about like the siren goes off like in the firehouse, brr, brr, brr. And they're going to say, you know, be on alert. There's something, you know, dangerous coming your way. And so it's going to be really easily triggered by events, even that events that maybe don't pose any type of objective threat to the child. Let me think about a good example to give you guys. So for example, there are different things that can cause a trauma response, and those can be sights, smells, words, touches, feelings. So one example I can give you, but people don't think about this very much, is think about what your mom or your grandma or your wife or your husband cooks on your favorite holiday. Maybe it's Christmas or Thanksgiving. You know, what is that aroma? What does that smell? And does that trigger like a really good positive response in you? The same thing can happen with a negative trauma response. So let's say an abuser wears a certain cologne or perfume, that can trigger a trauma response. And so if totally unbeknownst to them, a teacher or some other type of authority figure wears that same cologne or perfume, that can actually trigger a trauma response when that person is not doing anything actually dangerous to that child. So that's just an example of how that amygdala can be overactive. So then on the other side, we have the hippocampus that is responsible for learning and memory. That actually can shrink as the amygdala is growing. And so what that means is a kid is not in a place where they're really able to learn or even remember, like, hey, last time my teacher walked by smelling this cologne, that wasn't a dangerous situation. So I need to learn that that's not a dangerous situation. The next time they walk by, I need to remember that that's not a dangerous situation. That's harder because that hippocampus, which is responsible for that, is shrinking. This also means in general that when a child is going through a trauma response, they're not able to learn and remember things. And so they're not in a headspace to be able to successfully learn in school when they're going through that type of trauma trigger. Also, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the thinking brain, and it's responsible for behavior, cognition, and social emotional regulation. And that actually either shrinks or can entirely shut down when a child is having a trauma trigger. And that's the part of the brain that allows us to go like, hey, stop. Am I in danger? Does the smelling of that perfume or that cologne, is that my former abuser? Like, no, that's not. Okay, then I'm safe. So that ability to kind of stop and think through, is that survival response, is that an emotional trigger? Is that an appropriate trigger, given what's actually going on around me? And so that is either, again, shrunk down or turned off altogether. And so if you have a child who is going to be very hyper alert and sensitive to potential trauma triggers, has less ability to kind of think through and decide, okay, I'm actually safe. I don't need to have kind of an explosive or frightening reaction. And to be able to turn their prefrontal cortex and their hippocampus back on so that they can learn in that learning environment, that's all going to be negatively impacted. We also know that the chemistry of the brain is impacted by trauma. So children who go through trauma have reduced cortisol levels, and those are responsible for energy levels and socialization. They also have reduced electrical connectivity in their brain, which is, those synapses that are firing, that are helping you make those connections and learn and process. So overall, that reduced brain connectivity and energy level causes kids who are going through trauma triggers to process information much more slowly, if at all. And this can be both social information and academic information. And this slower processing is not understood as part of, what's happening in relationship to a trauma trigger, can frustrate the student. They can think like, why don't I get this? I'm really stupid, and it can impact their self-esteem. It can also cause frustration on the part of a teacher, or, if a kid is getting in trouble at school, maybe a dean of discipline or an administrator. And if the kid is not processing that information fast enough, that adult is very likely to think that the child is being defiant by not answering a question that they are asked, or that they're not motivated or they don't care about school. Dr. Howard talked a little bit earlier about how so many of our suspensions are caused by defiance. And if we kind of frame it this way, what we might be seeing is if a kid is going through a trauma trigger, they're actually not being defiant at all. They're actually just barely processing or very slowly processing the information that's coming into them. And so if we also have that unconscious racism or implicit bias layer going on top, and we're surveilling our children of color more and kind of judging their reactions more or differently, this is how we can see those really high levels of school suspensions and expulsions occurring. Also, if kids are processing social cues more slowly, that means that they're more likely to have misunderstandings with their peers, potentially leading to the quote unquote fights that led to those increased school suspensions and expulsions. So all of that can be negatively impacting kids as well. So there's lots of different signs of trauma, kind of typically organized by age. And You know, when kids are young, they might be irritable or fussy, difficult to calm, tantruming, clingy, you know, kind of middle school level-ish. You might see changes in school performance, withdrawing, you know, demonstrating signs of depression, tears, or sadness. And then in the high school ages, you know, they might be reliving and talking about that trauma, refusing to follow rules, be tired all the time, really doing that withdrawal, fighting, risky behaviors, drugs and alcohol use, etc. And, you know, it is very easy to look at each of these age ranges and say like, but yeah, but a typical teenager does all of that stuff. And that's true. But what we're looking at here, or what we're looking for here, is kind of an excessive amount of these types of behavior kind of outside of that normal range. So just some statistics to bore you with. Children who have 4 or more ACEs are 32 more times to have issues learning and have behavioral problems at school as non-traumatized kids. Kids are more likely to be retained, to have irregular attendance, to be placed in special ed cases if they're going through trauma. They tend to have actual lower GPAs. They actually also score lower on standardized testing of cognition. Research demonstrates about 8 points lower than a child who's not going through trauma. And kids with ACEs are more likely to have early initiation of sexual activity, adolescent pregnancy. A couple of things that I like to talk about on this slide that aren't as typically understood is a couple. So first, criminalization of normal adolescent behavior. So for example, I have a sister, and me and my sister would fight about clothes and boys and different things like that. And this is a long time ago. So when I would get mad at her, I might throw my hairbrush at her. These days, kids throw their cell phones. They didn't have cell phones back in my day, or they were like the big brick cell phones that you see like in really old school music videos. So anyways, in my household, I might have gotten grounded for that. If you're in a foster home or in a group home, you might be arrested on a threat with a deadly weapon. So when I talk about criminalization of normal adolescent behavior, that's what I'm talking about. I also like to touch on this idea of broken social contracts. We are certainly living in a universe where the awareness of well known, which is great. I also, of course, need to position myself as a middle-class white woman when I talk about this. So want to do that as well. So even though this doesn't apply to everyone or even most people, at least let's say in white society, there is a social contract that police officers and firemen are there to help you and keep you safe. If we understand or acknowledge that social contract has been broken, certainly for people of color, you know, most particularly African-American males. But if we step back from that for just a moment and think about little kids, may have this idea that policemen or firemen are there to keep them safe. Yet, if those are the people that are ripping those kids away from their parents and away from their homes and away from their siblings, we have some broken social contracts there. I think we can also have social contracts around our educators and that teachers are good and they're there to help us. But when we have our kids, especially our kids of color, experiencing significant levels of school discipline, potentially their teachers being their reporters and causing them to be pulled out of their homes, we have a bunch of broken social contracts there. So I think it's just important to kind of have that language and talk about that language. Also like to mention that our kids are not only traumatized by the system, they are by being pulled into the system, but they are re-traumatized by the system at multiple points, not least of which is each home change. You know, when I'm doing this training in person, which of course I haven't done for quite a while, and I talk about home and school changes, I typically, this is a point where I ask people to stand up. And if you're feeling a little wiggly and you wanna do a little standing and stretching, I welcome you to do so. And then I ask people, like, how many people went to one middle school, one elementary school, and one high school, and they didn't experience any other school changes on top of that? If that's you, go ahead and have a seat if you're done stretching. And then we go on and we say, how many people had one school change? And if you just had one, go ahead and sit down. 2 school changes, 3 school changes, 4 school changes, right? And you guys can count up your own number. Kids in the foster care system on average go through 8 school changes. And that is a pretty darn big number. And that's on top of elementary to middle and middle to high school. So we'll call that 10 school changes altogether. And then I typically ask people in our audience, and please feel free to throw into the chat box any thoughts that you might have. But like, what does it mean to go through a school change? How is it hard? What are the difficulties? You know, changing a physical environment, changing a social environment, changing an academic environment. There's a lot that goes through that. And if you are lucky enough to have gone through a school change with your family intact, you would have lots of supports to help you through that, right? So if you lost all of your friends and you had broken relationships and you had to go through the struggle of being a new kid, thanks Lauren, you would still have your mom and your dad and, or, you know, your siblings or whoever you had at home as your primary caregiver, you would have them to come home to. Now imagine that you went through each of those school changes all by yourself. And at the same time, you were changing your caregivers, your foster siblings. You were changing where you lived, the rules about how you are supposed to live at home. You were changing the food that you were given and were allowed to eat. You were changing what time you woke up, what your access was to recreational activities like books or TV or sports, right? So think about these school changes and these home changes and think about how significantly traumatizing that can be for kids. So when I talk about the system itself re-traumatizes our kids, that is what is happening. It's really important. Sorry, my little niece is coming in and she's so cute. It's also important to talk about the fact that our kids in the foster care system are experiencing rates of PTSD that are more than twice as likely as our US war veterans that are returning. And so those are really, really high levels. All right, so just a couple more statistics. You know, kids in the foster care system have really significant levels of trauma. They have lots of different types of both externalizing behaviors. These are the things that are quote unquote getting kids in trouble, as well as a lot of internalizing behaviors. So like anxiety, depression, things like that. Also just a couple of actual education outcomes. So it's actually 83% of kids in foster care are held back by the 3rd grade. 83%. That's like almost all of them. We've got really low levels. We actually have kids in the foster care system are performing the worst on every single education outcome measured by the state with one exception. And that is English language learners on tests of English language development. The high school graduation statistics are actually getting worse. So if we compare graduation last year to graduation this year, we actually saw the gap between the typical high school graduation number is about 84%. And the foster youth graduation number is now down to 51%. And that gap increased 4% in the last year, which tells us that what we're doing is not working. And less than 3% are obtaining a higher education degree, although 90% or more of foster youth who are surveyed say that they want to go to college and get a degree. So those are some, unfortunately, very sad statistics that I do think are important to share. So I'm going to pause for just a second and take a breath, see if you guys have any questions, and then we're going to move on to the next topic we are going to cover. Anybody have any questions for me? All right, well, I'm going to keep rolling along because we actually have a lot to cover in the next 35 minutes. All right, so the next thing I am going to talk about are the general education rights of foster and probation youth. Now, the people that I specialize in helping are foster and probation youth, but a lot of the laws that I'm going to cover now actually cover a larger group of highly mobile student populations. So they include homeless youth, youth who are in families that migrate, either within the state or in and out of the state. Typically, we're looking at farm or fishing workers who are following kind of the migratory patterns of harvest and catches. It also applies to kids in military families who are moving significantly for that reason. So all of these laws apply to all of those groups, although I'm going to specifically talk about foster and probation youth because those are the kids that we serve. So this is, you can't see it very well. Let me shrink it down a little bit more. This is our foster youth education toolkit. This was a tool that was designed specifically for school districts. Starting in 2004, so about 16 years ago, California started passing a set of laws that were specifically designed to improve education outcomes of foster youth. And then, of course, over the years, we added more and more student populations into that highly mobile definition. And we've also kind of increased and improved upon the rights and protections of these kids. All of these rights are specifically created to attempt to address the school instability and the negative education outcomes that these kids are having. So the first topic that I am going to talk about is specifically school stability. So school of origin is a specific right that all of these kids have that basically says, even if you are moving homes and changing residences and changing school districts, you still have a right to stay in your school of origin. The idea being that we want to keep kids stable in school, even if they're moving around all the time. And school of origin is defined pretty expansively. It could be whatever the last school you went to. It could be any school that you went to when you were first removed from your parents. So let's say you were removed from your parents in kindergarten, but now you're in middle school. You can actually go back to the resident school. So typically what happens is kids are kind of funneled from one elementary school into one middle school into one high school, and they stay with that same peer group kind of in their neighborhood. So you can go to the middle school if you've advanced onto middle school, even if your school of origin was an elementary school, or even into high school as well to reunite with that same peer group. And I think we all know our peer groups are extremely important to us all throughout our lives. And that's part of what we're looking to create some more stability for kids there. Or if kids are anytime in the last 15 months, if a youth attended a school where the youth feels a connection, and I actually really love this part of the law because it's not defined, the youth feeling a connection is not defined by adults. It's actually defined by the youth themselves. So if they said like, yeah, I went to the school 15 months ago, and I had a friend there that I really liked, that meets the eligibility. They had a sport that they played, a teacher they connected with, a counselor they connected with. It doesn't really matter as long as that youth feels a connection. If they've been to that school in the last 15 months, they have kind of a black letter law right to go back to that school, which is really great. The tricky part, I have a question here, why 15 months? I actually don't know the answer to that, Victoria. That's just how the law defines it. I'm not really sure where they come up with that number. You'd think like a year or 2 years or something like that. But the law defines it as 15 months, which is really very strange and a great question that I don't have an answer to. The difficult part about school of origin, especially in LA County, is that we live in a huge county. And so if a child is moved from Long Beach to Lancaster and their commute would be 3 hours each way every single day, what is the realistic ability for that kid to be able to do that commute? So the geography of our county is tough. The other part that's tough about it is the traffic. And I know we don't have traffic right now because not everybody's working right now. We certainly have reduced traffic right now. But when, people are back to work at some point, kids are back to going to school, how do we kind of manage that? And how do we get the kids back and forth? Are foster parents willing to drive them? Are their social workers willing to drive them? How do we get those kids back and forth? And so You know, taking into account how long that commute would be is really important. Will, you know, if the kid really wants to play sports after school, will driving them back and forth, you know, make it more difficult for them to access that. If they're not doing well academically and they need access to tutoring or more time to do their homework, that can impact their ability to be transported back and forth to their school of origin. We do have some things in this state to try to help the actual transportation piece. So caregivers have a right to receive an extra amount of money each month for transporting that kid to their school of origin, and that can be helpful. We also have something in the county, a multi-agency agreement in the county that allows kids to take a service called Hop, Skip, Ride, kind of like Uber for kids. And that has been many, many years in the making and still has quite a few kinks in it, but that is kind of up and running these days, or was before COVID. So it's important, you know, when working with these youth to think about the, you know, how difficult school and home changes can be and how much stability can be created by keeping a kid stable in school. Every single time I work with foster youth, I ask them, what is the one thing that helped you be successful in school? And every single time the answer is, oh, well, so-and-so believed in me or helped me or supported me or cared about me. It's always a person. It's always a person that they had a connection with and a relationship with. And if they have that connection and that relationship at a school, I frankly will move heaven and earth to keep a kid at that school with that person that they think cares about them. So that's been really important. All right. Great question, Victoria, about whether or not the ability to stay in school of origin works for kids living with their kin, aunts, grandparents, etc. So right to school of origin is for every single person with an open case in the dependency court. Does not matter who they live with, but that case does have to be open. The right to go to your school of origin extends for elementary and middle school. If your court case closes in January, for example, you have a right to stay in that school of origin to finish out the school year. And if you're in high school, even if it's like the first day of 9th grade and your case closes, you actually have the right to stay in your school of origin until high school graduation. That's important as well. In terms of the funding, either Hop, Skip, Ride ability, the Uber for kids, unfortunately, all of that funding goes away as soon as the case is closed. So the answer to your question is yes, you would have that right regardless of who you live, but your right to transportation and funding for transportation is dictated on whether you have an open foster care court case or a closed court case. And kids living with aunts and grandparents in kin can have open cases or closed cases. It totally depends on the situation. So if you are not going to stay in your school of origin for whatever reason, fosters have a right to immediately enroll in school without anything, without a uniform, without a transcript, without a copy of their IEP, without their shots, without anything. They have a right to immediately enroll in school. They also have a right to be enrolled in the same classes they were at as at their prior school. We hear a lot like, oh, well, that class is full, or you were in AP calculus, sorry, like that class is full over here, you're too late. So kids do have that right to be enrolled in the same or equivalent class. Kids also cannot be forced to attend a continuation school, even if they're coming in mid-semester, even if they're credit deficient, even if they have behavioral problems. They cannot be forced into those alternative school settings, which actually happens all the time, unfortunately. So those are your basic enrollment rights. Kids in foster care, on probation, et cetera, those highly mobile kids also have a specific set of rights when they are in high school, specifically related to trying to get them to graduate. So the first of the two rights related to high school directly is related to partial credits. When kids in foster care move high schools mid-semester, they often will lose credits. They will not get their credits from their first school or their second school or either. And there is a very specific law that says they do have a right to those credits for any of the work that they learned, that they completed while they were at the school. And that is proportional to their attendance. You know, for example, if you spent 2 months in one school and 3 months in another school, you would get maybe 2 credits for one school and 2 credits from the other school in each of your classes. And finally, kids who are in high school who are moving high schools after completing their 2nd year, so typically you'd be in 11th grade or be a junior. If you are moving schools and because of that move, you're not able to meet the local district requirements, one of the things that we can do is we can waive those local district requirements. So an example here is if you start at one school that requires no foreign language to graduate high school, and then you go to another school that requires 4 years of a foreign language, but you don't get there until your senior year, it's kind of obvious you're not going to be able to do 4 years of a foreign language while you are in there for only 1 year. And so we can waive those local requirements and we can make sure that kids can do just the state requirements to graduate. So we've got a question here about can you have access to the toolkit? Absolutely, this is publicly available. I put our website in the chat box. The toolkit is free to download for anyone. And that's really all I'm going to do on gen ed rights. I want to spend our last 20 minutes talking about special ed. But before we go there, I will pause and see if anybody has any questions. I know I talk really fast. It is because we've got so much to cover and I'm so hyped about the topics we are talking about. All right, so any gen ed questions? All right, so I'm gonna keep chugging along. So we're gonna talk about special education. Again, I'm only gonna be able to cover some of the basics. But we do have an education manual that goes into more detail. Again, this is available on our website, free to download. We're happy to have anybody access it. I'll also, maybe Taylor will, can send you guys my email. I'm always happy to answer questions offline about anything that I feel like I have the answer to. I'm happy to provide it. For us, it's just really important to make sure that all of our kids are getting access to all of the services and supports that they need. So we don't have any like proprietary about any of our tools or anything like that. All right, so when we're talking about really any education right for kids in the foster care or probation system, it's really important in general to talk about education rights. So in a typical family, mom and mom, dad and dad, parents automatically hold the legal right to make education decisions for their child. But for kids in the foster care and probation system, those rights may have been limited or terminated by the court. And so we need to be asking and talking about who legally holds education rights for these kids. Do we have a court order that proves that they hold those rights? And then they're the person who makes those legal decisions. So biological parents hold it by operation of being the parent. Adoptive parents and legal guardians hold it because those court orders transfer those rights to them. When a youth is 18 years old, they hold their own education rights. But other than that, you need a court order. And people who can hold education rights are foster parents, prospective adoptive parents, a relative or kin caregiver, CASAs. People who cannot hold education rights specifically are social workers, probation officers, and group home staff. Those people very often like to think that they control and make education decisions, and very often make decisions that are in the best interest of the child welfare and probation system, but not in the best interest of the youth. And so that's why they are actually legally not allowed to hold those rights, because they have a conflict of interest. So that's the very first important thing that we have to talk about. Okay, so we are going to talk now about special ed and when and why and how do kids need special ed. So I'm gonna suck you guys back in for our last 20 minutes here, and I would love to see in the chat box what might be something that you might see in a student's education record or hear from a student's caregiver or education rights holder that might clue you into the fact that the child is struggling in school and might need additional supports. And that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be special ed eligible, but just that we have an issue here that we need to look at a little bit further. So distracted, thank you, Jennifer. Inability to focus, awesome, Melanie. Thank you, Taylor. Maybe having poor grades. Any other ideas from you guys? Difficulty processing instruction or assignments, difficulty hearing and seeing, kids who are unmotivated, kids who are having problems with peer interactions, kids who are having problems socially adjusting, looking at their IEP records, absolutely. Kids who are having struggled with reading, have delayed speech, have low test scores, repeated instances of school discipline, problems with feeding or needing equipment at school. You guys are killing it. Yes, all of these things. So the question I asked without really asking it led you to the actual legal standard. So in order to be eligible to receive a special education assessment, all we have to do is show that the child is suspected of having a disability. And that's actually a really low standard. And it's pretty easy to meet that standard. Any kid who has a diagnosed disability, and the ones we really commonly see in the child welfare system are ADHD, depression, PTSD, anxiety, FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Any of those diagnoses kind of meets and exceeds that legal standard. Anyone can request a special education assessment, and there is a process for how to do this. So anybody can refer a child for a special ed assessment. Pre-COVID universe, the school district had 15 calendar days to respond to that assessment request. And they either had to agree to and grant the assessment, or they had to refuse to do the assessment in writing and explain the reason why they were refusing to do it. Now, unfortunately, like 2 days after COVID kind of officially hit California and the governor closed our state down, the legislators passed a law saying that that 15-day timeline was no longer in effect, meaning that they basically stopped all special ed testing, which is really unfortunate because I think we have a lot of youth who are experiencing significant amounts of academic difficulty in accessing distance learning services, as well as significant levels of social and emotional trauma being caused by the social isolation. And, you know, if they're getting sick and have health issues, all of those things can be basically creating new disabilities that did not exist before COVID. And unfortunately, none of those kids have a right to start a special ed assessment process right now because districts can choose to ignore the requests of their education rights holders to get those kids assessed. Now, we are in the process of trying to get that law off the books, especially as the new school year starts, but I did want to throw that out there. Once a school district agrees to do testing for a student, an education rights holder has to sign. Yeah, Taylor.
Sorry, I just want to pause you, Jill, because you said something that's really important, and that is that we are trying to change, you know, this new policy from taking effect. And I just really want to call out for the students that, you know, in addition to this like individual level advocacy that you're doing for like a single child, you and the Alliance do an incredible and meticulous job at watching the policies that are coming out and speaking out on behalf of the kids that the Alliance serves to say, no, that's not going to work for us. We need to tweak it. We need to change it. And you know, for the students that were asking like earlier in the talk about like how it is that we push back against the system, or how do we reimagine the system, that's a perfect example of that. And it's sometimes the case too that the Alliance will say, well, there is no policy and this is what it should be, state, so here's the model policy that you should now adopt, and is often successful at that. So I just wanted to, I think it's easy to breeze past that because it's just like, it's what you do. But it's a really critical point that we're not just passively, you know, watching this system go by and happen to these kids. Places like the Alliance do a beautiful job at really speaking out about what should be different.
Thanks, Taylor. So I think we also got a really great comment from Caitlin about how, and I think this is what you're talking about, Caitlin, about how difficult it is to think about how do you conduct a meaningful special education assessment for a kid when we're remote, when it's not safe to be in person. And that is absolutely true. So in the special education universe, assessments have to be both valid and reliable. So valid means they're actually testing what they say they're supposed to be testing. And reliable means you can give the same test over and over and over again and get the same results. And so there are really important questions related to validity and reliability in terms of giving kids remote testing. At the same time, we have a bunch of kids who are developing disabilities, who are not accessing their education. I mean, if we talk about the achievement gaps between kind of our student populations in the state of California, by disability, by foster care status, by English language learner status, by race and ethnicity, etc., those gaps are only widening right now. The ability to have access to internet and computers, to access distance learning, to have parents that understand how to use that technology, that have parents that speak English and can access technology because of that or can't, that have parents that are not caring for multiple children and or sick relatives who are potentially, you know, frontline workers who are being forced to work outside of the home. So their ability to, number one, create a, you know, an appropriate or quiet learning environment within a home and or support a child attempting to access distance learning. All of those things, I think we're only seeing that equity gap widen. And so it is very, very difficult to think about how do you do a special ed assessment reliably and validly during distance learning. On the flip side of that, we have kids who are absolutely struggling and are being devastated by the distance that it's going to be 100% distance learning next year for the foreseeable future, and that could be all year long, which is absolutely terrifying. And I think a lot of other districts are going to be following suit. And so we're in this like really weird situation where we have to battle these like two basically impossible things. Oh man, this stuff is hard. Okay, so the other thing I just want to spend a little bit of time on, so assuming a kid can access a special ed assessment and can get assessed and you can get to an IEP meeting, we then have to talk about eligibility. And I'm going to pause, go back to a question. So the question is there any kind of remote special ed assessments happening now, or is everything just on hold? I will say that from my experience, everything is 100% on hold. So from March to June of the last school year, I don't know of a single special ed assessment that occurred. I'll tell you a story about, I had a kid who needed 2 small, tiny little subtests on an academic assessment, and all of his other testing was done. And the assessor actually said, I actually think I can do those remotely as long as there's a parent on the other end to make that happen. And unfortunately, even though the assessor said they thought they could do it reliably and validly, the district like ordered them not to. So as far as I know, no testing is occurring right now. There are private assessors who are definitely doing assessments and are doing so, I think, reliably and validly. But districts are very there's a liability issue here, right? If you can prove that their assessment was bad, kids can actually sue and make the district pay for a private assessment. And so I think districts are very leery in wanting to kind of open themselves up to that type of liability. So it's tough. And if we're thinking about another 6 months or another entire school year without any testing happening, I mean, kids are, once they're eligible, are required to be tested every 3 years. That law was not waived. Also, kids were actually in the middle of assessment process. So once the assessment plan is signed, the district has 60 days, 60, to do the assessment and hold the IEP meeting. There was a bunch of kids who were in the middle of that timeline, and that timeline did not stop. So we have districts that are significantly legally out of compliance on that as well. So there are some assessments that just have to move forward, even if they're only partial, even if we're only doing pieces of them, they've got to move forward. And it is just, it is super difficult. We are struggling right now as advocates for what do we ask for? How do we ask for it? You know, what is essential? What can be done reliably and validly? And what do we not want to ask for? Because we don't think it can be done correctly, right? Like if we're looking at IQ or cognition and we don't think it's going to be valid, the last thing we want to do is have a kid be classified as intellectually disabled when they're not. So there's real serious life consequences to all of this. So this does bring me to so basically, if families can pay for private evaluations, are they getting them at this point? The answer to that is certainly yes. But there, like I said, there is an ability to force a district to pay for private assessments. And that's something that we actually do a ton of work around. I would say probably 50% of our clients end up getting district funded private assessments, either because the district did a bad assessment, or we're thinking about how do we use that if the district's refusing to do the assessment and they're out of legal timeline, they're violating the legal timelines. Can we force it then? So we're trying to think creatively around that. But yeah, there's a really important kind of financial low income equity gap there about who is allowed or is able to access assessments during this time. Okay, so to eligibility. I think it's important, and Dr. Howard really kind of started the conversation around this, but I want to touch on it as well. You know, what is our overrepresentation in special ed of children of color? And, you know, the eligibility categories are here: deaf and hard of hearing, specific learning disability, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, orthopedic impairment, speech and language impairment, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, autism, other health impairment, and multiple disabilities. And you know, we do have kind of some historical data and background. So for example, in 1980, a little boy named Larry, and his last name started with the initial P. He was a little African-American boy in LAUSD, and he said, look, LAUSD, you are screwing me over. You are taking IQ tests that are not culturally and racially normed, and you're giving them to African-American boys just like me, and you are disproportionately finding us to be, at the time, mentally retarded. Now we talk about intellectual disability. But back in that day, you were finding me to be mentally retarded, and I'm not. And your assessments are racially biased, and you have to fix them, and this is illegal, and you can't do it. And little Larry won. And so we do have this kind of historical, or we need to take a historical view of how children of color are overrepresented in certain eligibility categories. I think more commonly these days we see African-American and other children of color, especially boys, being overrepresented in categories, for example, such as emotional disturbance. And you get that category if you have behavioral or emotional issues. The flip side of that is that category actually offers kids some really significant protections against school discipline. So if you're special ed eligible, you are only allowed to be suspended for 10 days in any one school year. And once you reach day 11, or if you are being put up for expulsion, your IEP team needs to meet, and they have to do this analysis. It's called a manifestation determination analysis. And the analysis is the behavior that led to the discipline a manifestation or substantially related to the child's disability? And if the answer to that question is yes, the behavior that led to the discipline is related to the child's disability, then we actually have to stop the discipline. We have to stop the suspension, and we have to stop the expulsion, because then we're disciplining a kid based on their disability, and that's illegal discrimination based on disability. And so that actually provides a significant amount of protection for kids. And, you know, if a kid, for example, has PTSD or has depression or has oppositional defiance disorder or different types of diagnoses like that, it is hard to think about, you know, how do you, you know, what's the bigger evil here, right? And you're choosing between really bad choices. Do you, you know, fight to get them eligible, to get them access to services that can hopefully help that disability and help them do better in school, and get them that protection? Or do you leave them in a broken system without any services and without any protections? You know, I am a special ed attorney, so we typically fight to get kids access to services and protections. I don't necessarily think that that is the right answer in every case, but that, you know, that's my background, my professional training, and that's when parents call me and say, my kid is being suspended every day, they're kicking him out of school, but I know he's smart, I know he's capable of learning, I need help. You know, that's the tool that I have to help them. It's really, really tough. We also, and you guys, I'm watching your comments, they're amazing. You know, sometimes some of these labels can push these kids into segregated classrooms. We actually fight really, really hard to keep kids in a gen ed setting and, for example, give them behavioral and emotional supports in those gen ed settings. But that is something that definitely happens, which is really difficult. The other thing to think about that I see every day is not only are kids overrepresented in certain categories, they're actually underrepresented in lots of other categories. So we have families who are suspicious of the system, and, you know, are, you know, scared to reach out and ask for help. They're scared that if they make a fuss, or if they question the system, that their kids are going to be increasingly targeted for school discipline. And so they're not asking for assessments, and they're not getting their kids eligible as well. So we have this really weird kind of both over and under representation, which is really tough. So we're almost at time. You guys have all these great comments. I could talk about all of these subjects for hours on end and bore you to tears, but I want to give at least a couple of minutes for questions, because I'm sure you've got them. You're also probably very tired and, or like me, maybe very hungry. You guys have been amazing. I'm happy to hang out and ask questions, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Taylor and let you guys go and take a break.
All right, so my question for you is not necessarily substantive, but rather we will provide the link to the Alliance for Children's Rights website, but I'm sure there are many students who might want to know if there's internship opportunities, things like that with the Alliance, and I wondered if you could speak to that briefly.
Absolutely, that's such a great question, Taylor. Love it. Yes, we run internships, both legal interns, social interns, undergraduate interns, professional internships. We run them all year long, spring, fall, and summer, in all of our different programs. We love working with interns in our education program. I call us the teaching hospital of special ed. I like to envision myself running around like I'm in Grey's Anatomy. But yes, we love working with interns, and we work really hard to give our interns a really amazing learning experience. We just ran our entire summer remotely, and I think we were really successful. We'll probably be doing the same thing in the fall. Our pro bono coordinator's name is Kathy Yakub. You can certainly, if you're interested in applying, come directly to me. But if you're interested in any of our other programs, I can get you moving in that right direction as well. And like I said, we're doing adoptions, guardianships, healthcare, including mental health and working with pregnant and parenting youth. We do financial benefits work. We're working with youth who are transitioning out of the system. So big shout out. I know you guys do amazing work, and we would love it if you would come learn from us a little bit and let us learn from you too.
Thank you so much, Jill. I'm also happy to talk about anything Alliance related. I'm a proud Alliance for Children's Rights alumna, and really thank Jill for being with us today. Jill, we'll let you go. And before we do that, we'll give you a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, your dedication, all you do for our kids 365 days a year. You are a true warrior for our kids and families. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and healthy out there.
Thank you. Bye, Jill.
Bye.
All right, you guys. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Many thanks to Dr. Howard, to Jill Rowland for their time and expertise. I hope at this point in the sessions, you guys are starting to see there's so many different types of people who work in this field. There's many different perspectives. And to that end, there's a place really for everyone in child welfare. And we're really excited to continue our sessions on on Tuesday of next week. And I think you guys will really enjoy hearing from our 4 different speakers. They're going to talk about really nuanced areas of child welfare. And we look forward to having you then. As far as the secret word, it's PINK, P-I-N-K. And Brittany will send out the form. She put it in the chat. Please, fill that out. And I'm sorry, we're 2 minutes over. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next week. Email us with questions, and don't forget, office hours are on Monday from 3 to 4. We welcome your presence and would love to talk. Okay? Many thanks. You guys have a great weekend. Be safe. Take care. Thank you again.